I was making my third round of the morning shift when the gate alarm went off. That sound, I had heard it maybe twice in 4 years of working at the Ridgefield Animal Shelter, and both times it was a false trigger from a weather sensor on the east perimeter. So I reached for my radio with the unhurried confidence of someone expecting a technical glitch, and I started walking toward the sound at a pace that still qualifies as professional but doesn't involve running. That changed 30 seconds later when I heard the screaming. Not one voice, not a child who'd scraped their knee in the visiting area or a volunteer startled by a dog's bark. This was the full-volume, directional panic of a crowd that had collectively decided something was very wrong and that the correct response was to move away from it as fast as possible. I broke into a run before my brain had finished processing what my ears were telling it, and I came around the corner of the main kennel block into the outdoor visiting courtyard and stopped so fast I nearly fell forward. Brutus was out. He was in the center of the courtyard, all 94 pounds of him, moving at a full run with his ears back and his body low, the way a dog moves when it is not playing and is not confused and has exactly one destination in mind. The visiting hour had been in full swing, families, volunteers, a school group of maybe 15 children in matching yellow vests. Now the courtyard looked like a fire alarm had gone off inside a crowded theater. Adults were grabbing children and pulling them behind anything solid, the wooden observation benches, the equipment shed near the south wall, the narrow corridor that led back to the main lobby. A man in a blue jacket had pressed himself flat against the chain-link fence of the adjacent enclosure as though he could push himself through it. 2 of our shelter guards, both of them, I noticed, had backed against the outer wall, were shouting into their radios with the specific urgency of people who have a protocol for this situation and are finding that the protocol does not feel adequate. I grabbed my radio and told dispatch we had a containment breach in the main courtyard, requested immediate backup, and confirmed that Brutus file number G117, German Shepherd Behavioral Flag, the dog the intake report described as unpredictable and potentially dangerous to the public, was loose among visitors. I told them to send the veterinary response team, and I told them under no circumstances to send anyone in without instruction from me first. Then I started moving and thinking at the same time, which is harder than it sounds when your legs are already ahead of your thoughts. I had been the one to process Brutus when he first came in 8 months ago, surrendered by his second owner with an incident report that made the intake desk go very quiet. 2 biting incidents, both documented, both involving men who had come onto the property unannounced. The file said aggressive, fear-reactive, unpredictable. What the file did not say, what files rarely say, was that in 8 months of daily contact, I had never once seen Brutus act without a reason. He was not a violent animal. He was a frightened one. The difference is everything, and in the confusion of a containment breach, it is the first thing that gets lost. I pushed through to the front of the courtyard and looked for the gate. The latch on kennel 4, Brutus's kennel, had been flagged for maintenance 6 weeks ago. I had submitted the report myself. There it was, the door hanging open at the end of the run, the latch broken clean through at the base, the metal distorted in the way that says this was pushed rather than picked. Something had startled him in the night or the early morning. He had hit the door at full weight, and the mechanism that should have held had failed because we had not fixed it. That was a failure of process. That was a failure I was going to have to account for, but not now. Now I needed to find where he was going. Because Brutus was not attacking anyone. That was the thing I registered in my first clear look at the courtyard, the thing that the screaming made it difficult to notice, but that stopped me for a half-second of genuine confusion. He was running through the crowd the way a river runs through a landscape, moving around the people rather than toward them, entirely focused on something beyond them, something none of us could see. His head was up and tracking. His nose was working. He was not a dog that had snapped from fear into aggression. He was a dog that was looking for something. I followed his line of travel through the chaos and saw what he was moving toward. At the far side of the courtyard, near the entrance to the small animal observation path, stood a child. She was perhaps 5 years old, small even for that age, with short dark brown hair cut just below the chin and a pair of blue medical scrubs, the kind staff and family members of veterinary personnel sometimes wear, that were a full size too large for her, the sleeves ending past her wrists, the pants cuffed twice at the ankle, blue sneakers, both hands hanging at her sides. She was standing completely still in the middle of the emptying courtyard with the particular quality of stillness that is not frozen fear, not the paralysis of someone who has lost the ability to decide whether to run, but something more deliberate than that. She was watching the dog come toward her with the expression of a child who recognizes what she is looking at and is not afraid of what she sees. Behind her, the last of the visitors who had been near that section of the courtyard were still running. Adults twice her height and 10 times her weight were clearing the space around her as fast as they could move. She did not move with them. She did not look at them. She watched Brutus, and her face held nothing that resembled fear. I shouted a warning. The words left my mouth before I had fully decided on them, something about standing back, about not approaching, about the dog being unpredictable, and she turned her head briefly in my direction, registered me with a look that I can only describe as patient, and then returned her attention to Brutus. He was 15 feet away now, 10, still running, still fully committed to whatever he was running toward. Behind me, I heard one of the guards shout something about a tranquilizer gun, and I spun around and told him with a firmness I did not know I had in me to hold his position. Do not fire, wait. He looked at me like I had lost my mind. I turned back to the courtyard. Brutus had stopped. He was standing 3 feet in front of the small girl, both of them completely still, the space between them vibrating with something I don't have a clinical word for. The dog was breathing hard from the run. His barrel chest expanded and contracted. His ears, which had been flat during his charge, were now forward, curious, not aggressive, and his dark eyes were fixed entirely on her face with an intensity that was not threatening, but was the most focused thing I had ever seen in an animal. The girl raised her hand. Slowly, palm forward, in the exact gesture I had been trained to describe as a non-threatening offer of contact. And Brutus lowered his head toward it. Welcome, and if this is your first time on this channel, I need you to stay right where you are. What you just witnessed is not the end of this story. It is barely the beginning. We find the moments that don't make it into the official report, the ones that challenge what we think we know about fear, about animals, and about the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage until you see it up close. Our team has a real goal right now. We are pushing to reach 1,000 subscribers this month, so we can keep bringing you stories exactly like this one every single day. If you believe what you just saw deserves to be seen, subscribe right now and become part of something that is actually being built. And before we go any further, drop your rating in the comments. Scale of 1 to 10. How intense was that opening for you? We read every single one. We'll come back to your numbers at the end. Brutus is still standing in that courtyard. The guard still has his hand on that tranquilizer gun, and I still have no idea who this child is or why the most feared dog in this shelter just stopped dead in front of her like he'd found the only person he was ever looking for. Let's go. The first thing you learn in any emergency training worth its certification is that the crowd is not your ally. I had sat through the shelter's crisis protocol review twice, once when I was hired and once 18 months later when the county updated its animal containment guidelines following an incident at a facility 3 towns over. Both times, the trainer had said the same thing in different words. When a large animal breaches containment in a public space, the animal is rarely the most immediate danger. The crowd is people running in confined spaces, people making decisions at full adrenaline with incomplete information, people who see one person running and start running themselves without knowing what they are running from or where they are running to. The animal has one set of instincts. A panicked crowd has several dozen, all of them operating simultaneously and none of them coordinated. Standing at the edge of that courtyard, I understood the training in a way I never had sitting in a conference room with a laminated handout. The visiting courtyard at Ridgefield is not a large space, roughly the dimensions of a school gymnasium, open to the sky, with 3 wooden observation benches arranged along the north wall and a low decorative fence separating the visitor area from the Kennel Run access corridor. On a normal Saturday morning, it holds maybe 30 to 40 people comfortably. This had been a normal Saturday morning until about 90 seconds ago. Now those same people were trying to occupy the exits simultaneously, and the exits were not designed for simultaneity. The main lobby corridor to the north had become a compression point. People were funneling into it from both sides, those who had been near the kennel runs on the east and those who had come in from the observation path on the west. And the corridor was wide enough for 2 people walking comfortably, which meant it was approximately wide enough for 1 person moving at the pace that fear produces. I could see the backup from where I stood, bodies pressing forward, a woman with a child on her hip angling sideways to squeeze through, a teenage boy, part of the school group, still in his yellow vest, completely stationary in the middle of the flow with his back against the wall and his eyes shut, which told me his brain had made a different choice from his legs, and neither of them was winning. I made a decision. The dog was still in the courtyard. The crowd was the immediate problem. I moved to the corridor entrance first, not toward Brutus, and I raised my voice to a register I had not used since a summer working crowd control at a county fair in my early 20s. Not a shout adds to the noise and becomes part of the chaos it is trying to resolve, something lower and more deliberate than a shout, a command that the body recognizes before the mind has processed the words. Slow down, single file, nobody is being chased, slow down and move. A few people near the entrance turned at the sound, not many, but a few is enough to create a disruption in the flow pattern, and a disruption in the flow pattern is enough to give the people behind them a second to recalibrate. The woman with the child on her hip glanced at me, then at the corridor, and made a decision to stop pushing sideways and simply walk forward at a normal pace. The teenager against the wall opened his eyes. I made eye contact with him specifically and said more quietly, "You're all right, walk forward, stay with the group." He peeled himself off the wall and moved. I turned to the 2 shelter guards who had positioned themselves against the east wall. Both were men I had worked alongside for years, and both were doing what trained people do when training does not cover the specific texture of what is in front of them. They were covering the procedural elements with great focus, radios out, hand positions correct, eyes on Brutus, and missing the human emergency developing 15 feet to their left. "Walters," I said to the nearer one, "the school group, get them out through the service entrance on the south side. All 15 of them, count them as they go, don't let any of them circle back." He looked at me, then at Brutus, then he made the correct assessment and moved. The second guard, Ray's, I left where he was because he had positioned himself at a point that gave him a sightlane to Brutus without being in the dog's direct travel path, and that was useful. I told him the same thing I had told dispatch. Do not approach, do not corner, do not fire unless the animal makes direct contact with a person. He nodded once, the way people nod when they don't fully agree but recognize who has the information. The courtyard was thinning. The bulk of the crowd had pushed through to the lobby. What remained were the people at the edges, the ones who had been furthest from the exits when the breach happened and had made the instinctive calculation that moving toward the dog's path was worse than staying put. A man and a woman, a couple, had pressed themselves into the corner formed by the observation bench and the north wall. An elderly man in a blue waterproof jacket sat rigidly on the bench itself, both hands on his knees, not moving, not out of courage, I don't think, but out of the particular stillness that arrives when the body decides that any movement at all feels like the wrong movement. A shelter volunteer I recognized, a college student named Bree, who came on Thursday and Saturday mornings, stood near the entrance to the small animal path with a lead in her hand, and an expression that said she had stopped in the middle of walking a dog that was no longer with her, and was still processing the sequence of events that had produced this situation. I told each of them in order the same thing: stay where you are, do not move toward the dog, do not make a sudden noise, you are safe where you are. That last part was an operational decision rather than a guaranteed fact, and I knew it when I said it. But what crisis management training also teaches, what it teaches quietly, in the material people don't put on the laminated handout, is that in the gap between panic and safety, the voice that projects certainty buys time. It does not need to be certain. It needs to sound certain enough to give frightened people something to anchor to while the actual situation resolves itself. And the actual situation, I was beginning to understand, was not what any of us had thought it was. Because Brutus had not redirected toward the thinning crowd, he had not taken the exit paths that were opening up as people cleared. He had moved, with a consistency that I was only now registering as purposeful, toward the one part of the courtyard that fear had emptied of everyone except a 5-year-old girl in blue scrubs who had declined to leave. I had been managing the crowd. I had been doing my job. And the entire time I had been doing it, something was unfolding at the far end of that courtyard that none of my training had prepared me for. Panic is a contagion. This is not a metaphor, it is behavioral science. Research in crowd psychology consistently demonstrates that individuals in a group will adopt the emotional state of those around them with a speed and thoroughness that bypasses rational evaluation. People who, in isolation, would stop and assess a situation instead run because the people beside them are running, and the running confirms the danger, and the confirmed danger accelerates the running. In the Ridgefield courtyard that morning, the majority of the danger to human life came not from a 94-pound German shepherd who was, as events would prove, looking for a specific person, but from 38 people trying to occupy 2 exits at once. The dog did not injure anyone that morning. The crowd injured 4, 2 sprained ankles, 1 bruised shoulder, 1 child's elbow scraped on the corridor wall. In every crisis, the first thing to manage is not the threat. It is the response to the threat. The space between those 2 things is where most of the actual harm occurs. I have a clear memory of the exact moment I stopped trying to manage the situation and started simply watching it. It was the moment Sandra moved her feet. Not to run, not to step back. She adjusted her stance, shifted her weight from one blue sneaker to the other with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone settling in rather than preparing to leave. And then she was still again, but a different kind of still from before. Before, she had been standing the way a child stands when they are waiting for something to arrive. Now she was standing the way a person stands when they have made a decision, and the decision is complete, and everything that follows is simply the execution of it. There is a weight to that kind of stillness that is different from passivity. You can feel it from 20 feet away. Brutus was covering the courtyard fast. He was running at full extension, the long, ground-eating stride of a shepherd at speed. The kind of movement that looks effortless until you understand the physics of it, and his trajectory was absolutely straight. No deviation, no circling or feinting, no of the lateral movement that signals aggression building toward contact. He was running the way an arrow travels, from a fixed point toward a fixed destination, with everything else in the environment simply not registering as relevant. The woman who had been near the small animal path entrance had cleared to his left. The elderly man on the bench was to his right. Brutus did not look at either of them. He was not hunting the space. He was navigating it, the way you navigate a room you know well when the lights are off, by memory and direction rather than by active observation. And Sandra was his direction. At 30 feet, I made the call I had been building toward since I first saw her standing there. I started moving, not running, because running would have changed the energy of the space in ways I couldn't predict, but walking fast, closing the distance between myself and the far side of the courtyard with the longest stride I could manage without breaking into a run. My radio was in my left hand. My right hand was out at my side in the position the training calls open and visible, which is the body's way of saying to an animal, I am not a threat and I am not hiding anything. Somewhere behind me, I was aware of Ray's tracking the movement, radio to his ear, and I was aware that the decision about whether to fire was probably 30 seconds away from becoming the question rather than the contingency. I got to 20 feet from Sandra before Brutus got to 15. I stopped because I understood, in the animal management part of my brain that operates on observation rather than protocol, that if I continued moving, I would enter his peripheral vision and introduce a variable that was not currently in his calculation. Right now, the courtyard, for Brutus, contained one relevant thing. I needed to not become a second relevant thing. So I stopped. And I watched what happened in the space between a 94-pound German shepherd at full run and a 5-year-old girl who had decided not to move. At 10 feet, he began to slow. Not abruptly, not the jarring deceleration of an animal that has registered an obstacle, but the gradual, deliberate reduction of speed that you see in a dog that is arriving somewhere rather than pursuing something. The ears came forward. The body lifted slightly out of the flat running posture into a more upright carry, the head coming up, the stride shortening and losing urgency. By the time he was 5 feet from her, he was moving at a trot, and by the time he was 3 feet away, he had stopped completely, his chest still working hard from the run, his breath coming in the visible, rhythmic expansion of an animal that had covered ground at speed and was now very still. Sandra had not moved during any of this. She stood with her hands at her sides and her chin at the level that, in a 5-year-old, communicates looking straight ahead rather than looking up at, which told me that she had calculated, on some level that does not require mathematics, the importance of not making herself smaller than she already was. Her eyes were on his face. Not on his teeth, not on his body, not tracking his posture for threat signals the way every adult in that courtyard had been doing from the moment the gate alarm sounded. She was looking at his face the way you look at the face of someone you know, checking in rather than assessing. She raised her right hand then. I described this in the hook, and I want to return to it now because the description I gave does not do it full justice. It was slow, genuinely slow, the kind of deliberate slowness that requires effort, because every instinct in a small person's body in that moment would have been producing a very different impulse. She raised her hand at the pace of someone who has decided that speed is the enemy of what she is trying to communicate. Palm forward, fingers together, at approximately the height of the dog's nose. It was the exact gesture her father had taught her. I did not know that yet. I would know it an hour later, sitting in the shelter director's office with Sandra's parents. Her father, a quiet man with the particular competence in his hands of someone who works with animals for a living. Her mother, who would explain the gesture in 3 sentences with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone describing a thing that is simply true in their household. She's been doing that since she could lift her arm. It's how we taught her to greet a dog. Still and slow, and let them decide. But in that moment, I knew none of that. In that moment, all I knew was what I could see. A child raising her hand with a slowness that was costing her something, and a dog that had gone completely, utterly still, his dark eyes on her palm, his breathing the only movement in a courtyard that had gone as quiet as I have ever heard an outdoor space go. Then Brutus lowered his head and pressed his nose, gently and with great deliberateness, into her open hand. Behind me I heard Ray's exhale. It was not a professional sound. It was the sound a person makes when their body has been holding a significant amount of tension and releases it without warning, the involuntary decompression of someone who had been prepared for something terrible and has just been presented with something else entirely. I stood in the middle of the courtyard with my radio in my hand and my protocol in my head, and no idea what to do next, because the scenario I was looking at did not appear in any document I had ever been given. A 5-year-old, a dangerous dog, 3 feet of open courtyard between them. And between them, nothing, no threat, no violence, just a large dog with his nose in a small girl's palm and a small girl who had not moved a single step. Behavioral science has a term for what Sandra demonstrated in that courtyard. It is called self-regulation under acute stress, and it is not instinctive. It is learned, or in some rare individuals, it is so deeply cultivated by environment and experience that it has become functionally indistinguishable from instinct. The clinical definition of courage is not the absence of fear. Every person who has studied the neuroscience of threat response will confirm that the fear cascade, the adrenaline release, the accelerated heart rate, the narrowing of attention, is not optional. It happens to everyone. What varies between individuals is not whether the cascade occurs, but what they do in the 3 to 5 seconds after it begins, before the fear has fully organized itself into action. In those seconds, something other than the fear gets to decide. Sandra was 5 years old. The fear was almost certainly present. What she did, with the seconds after it arrived, is what the rest of this story is about. The calm lasted exactly as long as it took for the backup team to arrive. I heard the side gate before I saw it open, the heavy clang of the reinforced panel that connected the staff service corridor to the visiting courtyard, the sound it makes when it is pushed with purpose rather than eased open with consideration. 3 men came through in quick succession. 2 I recognized as shelter security personnel from the weekend rotation, both larger than Rays, both moving with the coordinated urgency of people who had received a radio call that contained the words containment, breach, and dangerous animal, and had responded to those words rather than to the situation those words were failing to describe. The 3rd man I did not recognize immediately. He was wearing a different uniform, County Animal Control, the darker shade of green, the shoulder patch that carries a different jurisdiction and a different set of authorizations than a private shelter's internal security. He was carrying a catch pole in his right hand and a radio in his left, and the expression on his face was the expression of a professional who has been called to resolve a problem and intends to resolve it. All 3 of them stopped when they cleared the gate and saw the courtyard. I watched the animal control officer's face run through a sequence of adjustments, the initial scan for the threat, the location of the threat, the assessment of the threat's current behavior, and then the specific recalibration that happens when current behavior does not match the reported behavior. His eyes moved from Brutus to Sandra to Brutus again. His grip on the catch pole did not loosen. In my experience, a grip established on the way to a scene does not loosen just because the scene looks different from the briefing. The hands have already committed. He started moving forward. I moved faster. I positioned myself between him and the center of the courtyard, not blocking him physically. Because blocking an animal control officer in the execution of a response call is not something I had the authority to do and knew it, but placing myself in his direct path in a way that required him to acknowledge me before continuing. He stopped, looked at me. His expression said, "Move." I said, "Give me 60 seconds. He said, "Ma'am, that animal is a documented behavioral risk, and he is loose in a public." I know what his file says, I told him. I processed his intake. Give me 60 seconds to explain what you are looking at before you make a decision based on what you were told. That landed somewhere. Not completely, his posture did not change, and the catch pole did not lower, but he stopped moving forward, which was what I needed. Behind him, the 2 shelter security personnel had spread slightly to his flanks in the automatic triangulation of people who have trained for animal containment and are applying that training. The triangle they were forming had Brutus at its apex. It was textbook. It was also, in the context of what was actually happening in this courtyard, the most dangerous configuration possible. I turned to the 2 guards and told them to hold their positions and not to reduce the distance. One of them looked at the animal control officer for confirmation. The officer gave a small nod. They held. I turned back to the courtyard. Brutus had not moved during any of this. He was still standing 3 feet from Sandra, his nose still periodically dropping toward her extended hand, his body oriented entirely toward her with the exclusion of everything else in the environment that, to me, was the single most important data point in the situation. A fear-aggressive dog in an unfamiliar open space with multiple new people entering does not stay still and focused on one small person. A fear-aggressive dog does what fear does. It monitors, it tracks exits, it reads threats, it escalates in direct proportion to the number of potential threats in its immediate environment. 3 new people, 2 of them moving with the specific purposeful energy of containment personnel, should have produced exactly the threat cascade that Brutus's file predicted. It had not. His ears were forward. His body was low but not coiled. His attention was on Sandra with a consistency that I was running out of professional language to describe and was beginning to think about in a different register entirely, not as animal behavior management, but as something older and more fundamental than that. He knew her, not in the way dogs know a frequent visitor or a regular feeder, in the way that requires a history I did not yet have access to. I explained this to the animal control officer in the 60 seconds I had asked for. Not the history, I didn't have it yet, but the behavioral read, the absence of threat indicators, the duration of the stillness, the fact that in the 4 minutes since the breach, Brutus had not made contact with a single person in an open courtyard that had held nearly 40 of them. I told him that if we moved in with the catch pole now, in a triangulated approach on a dog that was currently calm, we would create the aggression we were trying to respond to. I told him I had submitted the maintenance report on that latch 6 weeks ago, and I was not going to stand here and let this dog pay the price for a piece of hardware that should have been replaced in October. The officer listened. He was a professional, and professionals, when they have 60 seconds and a coherent argument, are capable of updating their assessment. He did not lower the catch pole, but he shifted his weight back slightly, the physical equivalent of a pause, and he said, "How long do you want?" I said, "Long enough to find out who that child is, and why this dog ran straight to her across a courtyard full of people." He said, 5 minutes, then we do this my way. I said, fair. I turned back to the courtyard. Sandra was still standing in the same position she had occupied since before Brutus reached her. In the time that I had been negotiating behind her, she had not turned to observe us, had not shifted her weight, had not looked over her shoulder to find out what the sounds of arriving personnel and raised adult voices meant. She was, as far as I could determine, entirely unconcerned with the conversation that had just decided whether the dog she was standing 3 feet from lived or died. She had one hand on Brutus's head now. I had not seen her place it there. It had happened while I was turned away, and the dog had lowered himself slightly onto his haunches, the way a dog does when it has made the calculation that it is not going anywhere and might as well be comfortable. His tail was not wagging, but it was not rigid either. It was low and slow, the movement of an animal that has stopped measuring the situation for threats and has arrived at something closer to ease. 5 minutes. I needed 5 minutes, and I needed to know who this child was. I started moving toward them, slowly, at the angle the training calls non-confrontational approach, from the side rather than head-on, making myself visible without making myself a vector. Sandra heard me coming before I was close enough to speak. She turned her head at an angle that suggested she had been tracking me by sound for longer than I expected, and she looked at me with the dark, composed eyes of a child who has been taught not to startle easily. I crouched down to her level, always crouch, never tower, that one is in every protocol, and I said, as quietly as I could manage, "What's his name?" She looked at me for a moment in the way children look at adults who have asked a question they consider to have an obvious answer. "Brutus," she said, and then, as though this explained everything, which it turned out it did, "He stayed at our clinic before he came here. He was really sick, and my dad made him better." She paused. "He remembers me." Behind me, I was aware that 5 minutes had started. What happened in the Ridgefield courtyard that morning was a standoff in 2 directions simultaneously, one between a dog and a group of armed personnel, and one between 2 ways of understanding what was in front of them. The personnel with the catch pole were not wrong to be cautious. They were working from a file, from a protocol, from the accumulated institutional logic of a system designed to protect people from harm. But the file was a photograph taken in the worst moment of Brutus's life, and they were trying to use it to describe who he was on a different day entirely. The standoff that matters is never the one between the animal and the weapon. It is always the one between evidence and assumption, between what we are actually seeing and what we decided we would see before we arrived. That morning, a 5-year-old with her hand on a dog's head was the only person in the courtyard who wasn't fighting that second standoff. She had already resolved it. She simply knew what she knew. This is the moment I need you to make a decision, not about the story, about yourself. The guards in that courtyard had a choice, the catch pole or the pause, force or understanding. The system said one thing, the evidence said another. And somewhere in the 5 minutes between those 2 options, A child and a dog were waiting to see which one the adults would choose. If you believe kindness is stronger than force, if you believe pausing to understand is more powerful than rushing to control, drop the words "kindness is strength" in the comments right now. Let's see how many of us are standing on that side of the courtyard. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this community is being built out of exactly these moments. The people who pause, the people who look closer, subscribe and be part of it. 5 minutes is still running. Let's keep going. Her father arrived 11 minutes after I called the front desk and asked them to locate the adults accompanying the child in the blue scrubs. I know it was 11 minutes because I was watching the animal control officer's watch. He had positioned himself at the edge of the courtyard with the catch pole still in hand and the patience of a man who had agreed to 5 minutes and was now on a generous extension and knew it. Every minute that passed without an incident was buying us another minute, and every minute that passed without an incident was also, I was aware, building the case I needed to make when the shelter director arrived, and the question shifted from how do we contain this to what do we do with this dog. Sandra's father came through the main lobby entrance at a pace that was not quite running, but covered ground at the speed of a parent who has been told their child is in a courtyard with a loose dog and has decided that the difference between walking fast and running is not a distinction worth preserving. He was a compact man, mid-40s. With the kind of hands I noticed immediately, wide across the palm, careful at the fingers, the specific build of hands that have spent years in precise work. He was wearing a collared shirt with a small embroidered logo at the chest that I couldn't read from the distance. He came through the entrance and stopped, and his eyes found Sandra first, the way a parent's eyes always find their child first, before anything else in the frame resolves, and something in his posture changed. Not relief exactly. More like the adjustment a person makes when the worst version of a scenario does not materialize, and the body has to redistribute the energy it had already committed to responding to it. Then he looked at Brutus, and his face did something else entirely. He said the dog's name, quietly, from across the courtyard, the way you say the name of something you recognize from a different context and are not entirely sure belongs in this one. Brutus. The dog's ears moved. Not toward the sound, toward the memory the sound carried, if that distinction makes sense. His head came up slightly from Sandra's hand, and he turned his face in the direction of the man crossing the courtyard, and I saw in the dog's body the same quality of recognition I had seen when he first stopped in front of Sandra. Not alarm, not the gathering of a threat response, something the opposite of that. The particular settling that happens in an animal when the environment has just added something familiar rather than something new. I met the father halfway and introduced myself and began to explain. He stopped me before I had finished my second sentence. I know what happened, he said, or I know enough of it. I need to tell you something about this dog. He told me in the standing up version first, the compressed account, the one you give when there is still a man with a catch pole at the courtyard's edge and a clock on the conversation. Then later, in the director's office, with coffee that nobody touched and Sandra sitting in a chair beside him with Brutus finally on a lead at her feet, he told me the full version. What I'm about to give you is the full version, assembled from both. 14 months before Brutus arrived at Ridgefield with 2 surrender records and a behavioral flag, he had been brought to a small veterinary clinic on the eastern edge of the county, not as a patient in the ordinary sense, not brought in a carrier with an appointment card and an owner who sat in the waiting room. He had been left, tied to the fence post at the clinic's side entrance at some point in the night. No note, no identification, no collar with a tag. The veterinary technician who arrived for the early shift found him at 6:40 in the morning, and what she found was not the 94-pound animal who had covered the Ridgefield courtyard at speed 2 hours ago. What she found was a dog who could not stand. The infection had been progressing for what the subsequent examination estimated was between 8 and 12 days. It had started, they believed, piecing together the history from the wound patterns and the tissue damage as a bite wound on the left shoulder, probably from another dog, probably from an encounter that nobody had witnessed or reported. Untreated, it had spread. The tissue around the original site was necrotic. The fever when they took the temperature was high enough that the lead veterinarian, Sandra's father, said afterward that he had looked at the number twice because he did not believe a dog could be ambulatory at that reading. He wasn't, really. He was barely conscious. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and he responded to nothing except just slightly to the sound of voices. The clinical decision was not straightforward. A dog with no owner record, a wound that had been neglected past the point that suggested reasonable prospects of full recovery, an infection that had already done systemic damage. The calculus of resource allocation in a small private clinic is not a comfortable one, and Sandra's father had sat with it for the 20 minutes it took to complete the initial examination. He told me this without embarrassment and without apology. The calculus existed, he had run it, and then he had set it aside. Not because the math was wrong, because the math was not the only thing in the room. There was also a dog that was still breathing, whose body was still working against what was inside it, whose fever-bright eyes had tracked the movement of Sandra's father's hand during the examination with a persistence that said, in the language that does not require translation, "I am still here." He told his staff they were keeping him. What followed was 3 weeks that the staff of that clinic would reference for the rest of the time I knew any of them. The infection required surgical debridement, the removal of the damaged tissue, which itself required an animal stable enough to withstand anesthesia, which required first bringing the fever down to a range that made anesthesia survivable, which required IV fluids and antibiotics administered over 36 hours before they could touch the wound. Sandra's father slept at the clinic for 2 of those nights. Not because no one else was available, he had 2 technicians on rotation, but because he had made a decision about this dog and he did not make decisions and then leave them unattended. Sandra had come with him on the 2nd night. This is the part her father told me carefully, the way parents tell stories that involve their children and danger and a choice that turned out well, with the awareness that the outcome is not the same as the wisdom of the decision. She was 4 years old. She had grown up in the rooms of that clinic, the way children of people with consuming vocations grow up inside the vocation. It was simply the landscape of her life, the smell of it, the rhythms of it, the emotional weather of a place where things were frequently very sick and sometimes got better. She had sat beside kennels before. She understood at 4 more of what she was looking at in an animal's body than most adults accumulate in a lifetime. She sat beside Brutus's recovery kennel for 2 hours that 2nd night while her father worked at the desk behind her. She did not try to touch him through the bars. She talked to him, not in the performing, audience-aware way children sometimes talk to animals, but in the low, continuous, matter-of-fact way of someone sharing the room with another person and filling the quiet out of consideration rather than need. Her father could not hear the words from where he sat. But he could see that the dog's breathing, which had been rapid and uneven since admission, was slower by the time he looked up an hour into her vigil. He did not have a clinical explanation for that. He did not try to construct one. By the end of the 3rd week, Brutus was standing. By the end of the 4th, he was eating without encouragement. By the end of the 2nd month, he had followed Sandra to every corner of that clinic that the recovery ward connected to, and the staff had stopped trying to manage the boundary because the dog's attachment to the child was both absolute and completely benign. He simply went where she went, and where she was, he was calm. He was calm in the way that things are calm after they have been very close to not existing at all. The deep, specific calm of something that has been brought back and knows it. When the clinic's capacity reached the point where continued boarding was no longer feasible, they had reached out to Ridgefield as a placement option. They had submitted documentation. Sandra's father had written 3 paragraphs in the transfer notes about the dog's history, his temperament under the correct conditions, the specific contexts that produced anxiety, and the specific contexts that produced stability. I pulled those notes from the file that afternoon. They were there, underneath the incident reports, underneath the behavioral flag. They had always been there. No one had read past the flag to find them. What Sandra's family did for Brutus in those first 36 hours, the decision to keep him, the overnight vigil, the resources committed to an animal with no owner and uncertain prospects, was not extraordinary in the sense of being beyond human capacity. It was extraordinary in the sense of being a choice. The easiest version of that morning was to note the condition, assess the prognosis, and make a different call. Nobody would have faulted it. The system would not have recorded it as a failure, but the way we treat a living creature when it has nothing left to offer, when it cannot advocate for itself, when the outcome is uncertain and the cost is real, that is not a performance of character. It is the substance of it. Brutus survived because a man looked at a dog that was still fighting and decided that the fight deserved company. Everything that followed, the recovery, the attachment, the courtyard, the 5-year-old who did not run, everything followed from that one decision at 6:40 in the morning beside a fence post. The director's office had a filing system that I had always considered one of the shelter's quiet institutional achievements, color-coded, cross-referenced, digitally mirrored, with physical backup, the kind of organized infrastructure that speaks to someone having cared enough to build it properly. I had complimented it once, in my first year, to the woman who managed intake records. She had looked at me with the expression of someone receiving a compliment on a piece of furniture they assembled alone while everyone else was at lunch, and said, "A system is only as good as what people do with it after it's built." I thought about that on my way to the filing room. Sandra's father was in the director's office with his daughter and Brutus, and the animal control officer had been persuaded, through a combination of the behavioral evidence in the courtyard and the transfer documentation that Sandra's father had produced from his phone in photographs, to stand down from immediate action pending a formal review. That review was going to happen within the hour. The director had been reached by phone, was 20 minutes out, and had been described to me by his assistant as not happy, which in my experience of institutional directors meant that the first thing he would reach for when he arrived was the most defensible position. And the most defensible position in a containment breach situation is almost always the most severe outcome for the animal involved. I needed to be in that room with something more than a behavioral read and a father's account before he got there. I needed the file. Not the summary, not the flag that appeared at the top of the digital record and that I, along with every member of staff who had worked with Brutus over the past 8 months, had been reading as the primary document rather than the first page of a longer one. The actual file. The complete intake package, which included the transfer documentation submitted by the originating facility, which in Brutus's case was a small veterinary clinic on the eastern edge of the county that had apparently spent 2 months rehabilitating a dog that our intake process had subsequently reduced to 2 incident reports and a behavioral warning. The physical files were kept in a room off the main corridor, a narrow space with metal shelving that smelled of the particular combination of paper and climate control that institutional records produce. I knew the organization system well enough to find the G-Series kennel files without turning the light on, but I turned it on anyway because I wanted to see everything clearly, and I did not trust myself to read carefully in the half-dark with a clock running. Brutus's physical file was thicker than I expected. That was the first thing I noticed, and it stopped me for a moment in the way that a thing stopping you when you have no time to be stopped is its own kind of information. A behavioral flag file tends to be thin, the incident reports, the assessment notes, the cautionary annotations that accrete around an animal that the system has decided to manage rather than understand. Thin files mean the animal has been processed rather than known. What I was holding was not thin. It was the file of a dog that someone had taken the time to document thoroughly, and the documentation had come in from outside, and no one had read past the flag to find it. I sat down on the floor of the filing room, which is not a thing I would ordinarily do, and I opened the file from the back. The transfer documentation from the veterinary clinic was 15 pages. 15. I had worked in animal welfare long enough to know that a 15-page transfer document from a private clinic represents an unusual commitment of time and administrative effort. The standard transfer summary is 2 pages, occasionally 3 for complex medical histories. Someone had sat down and written this with the specific intention of making sure that whoever received Brutus next would understand what they were receiving, not just medically, contextually, historically, in the fullest sense of who this animal was and how he had come to be who he was. The first section covered the medical history I already knew from Sandra's father's account, the intake condition, the infection, the surgical intervention, the recovery timeline. But it was written with a clinical precision that transformed what I had heard as a story into something that functioned as evidence. Temperature readings on admission, tissue necrosis assessment with photographic documentation referenced by number, antibiotic protocol, dosage, duration. The fever reduction timeline charted across 5 days. The weight at admission, 21 pounds below what the breed standard indicated for his frame, and the weight at transfer 14 weeks later, within 4 pounds of healthy range. This was not a case summary. This was a record constructed by someone who wanted the next reader to be able to trace every decision and every outcome with enough specificity to trust both. The second section was behavioral. It was written in the same careful, specific language as the medical record, and it said things about Brutus that bore almost no relationship to the 2 incident reports at the front of the file. The transfer notes described an animal with a documented history of fear-based responses to sudden movement and unfamiliar male voices, specifically voices raised in the mid to upper volume range, that the clinic had traced to behavioral markers consistent with prior aversive conditioning. In plain terms, before the infection, before the abandonment, before the fence post at 6:40 in the morning, something had happened to this dog that had taught him that certain kinds of human behavior were precursors to pain. The biting incidents that appeared in his surrender records, both of them, I read now with the specific sick feeling of someone seeing the shape of an injustice clearly for the first time, had occurred in contexts involving sudden physical approach by men, both times in environments the dog was unfamiliar with, both times without the warning period that the transfer notes indicated he consistently required to establish safety before contact. He had not been aggressive, he had been predictable. The difference is enormous, and it is precisely the difference that the incident report format does not have a field for. The third section was the one that sat with me the longest. It was titled, in the plain administrative language of a transfer document, Additional Context Behavioral. It was 3 paragraphs long and it had been written, I could tell from the shift in register, the slight change in sentence rhythm, by someone different from the person who had written the medical sections, more personal, less clinical. The kind of writing that happens when someone decides that the formal structure of a document is not going to carry what needs to be said, and makes the decision to say it directly regardless. The paragraph I kept returning to read as follows, and I am going to give it to you as close to verbatim as my memory of that filing room floor allows. This dog came to us without a history we could verify and leaves with one we can. He is not an aggressive animal. He is an animal that learned from sources we cannot identify that trust was not safe, and he has spent his time here learning slowly, on his own terms, and with considerable evidence required that this is not universally true. He has made this determination independently. We did not train it into him. We provided the conditions, and he arrived at the conclusion himself, which in our experience indicates a resilience and cognitive capacity that should be understood as an asset rather than a complication. He will not transfer that trust automatically. It will need to be earned again in the new environment, with patience and consistency and the specific understanding that his caution is not malice. We ask whoever reads this to please read this before reading the incident reports that will appear at the front of this package, because the incident reports describe 2 moments and this document describes 14 weeks, and we believe the 14 weeks are more true. Someone had submitted this request. Someone had specifically asked that the file be read from the back. I was sitting on the floor of the filing room, reading it from the back, 14 months too late, and the 14 months sat on my chest with the specific weight of something that cannot be undone, but has to be acknowledged before anything useful can happen. The incident reports had been filed at the front. The flag had been applied. The flag had been the first thing anyone read when they pulled Brutus's record, and it had been the lens through which every subsequent interaction was interpreted. He lunged at a volunteer fear response, read as aggression. He refused handling during a routine examination, a predictable response to unfamiliar contact, read as uncooperative. The behavioral notes in our own file were written by people who had been told, by the flag, what they were looking at, and they had found what they were looking for, because that is what flags do. They do not describe, they instruct, and we had followed the instruction for 8 months without once opening the file to the back. I took the complete documentation, and I stood up from the floor of that filing room, and I went to find the director before he could reach for the most defensible position. I needed him to read 14 weeks before he read 2 incidents. The damage a label does is not always visible at the moment of application. It becomes visible later in the accumulation of interpretations that follow it, each one shaped by the label, each one reinforcing it, each one making the original label look more accurate than it was. This is sometimes called confirmation bias in the literature, but in practice it feels more like a closed door. Once the flag is applied, the file is read from the front. Once the file is read from the front, the flag is confirmed. Once the flag is confirmed, nobody goes to the back. The clinic that saved Brutus knew this. They wrote 15 pages precisely because they knew the front of the file would be read first, and they wanted to put something in the back worth finding. They asked for their work to be read before the incident reports. That request was not honored. It is worth asking, in any area of life where we carry files on people, on animals, on situations, how often we read the front and call it the whole story. I walked back into the director's office with 15 pages and the specific resolve of someone who has found the thing they needed and is now required to make it matter before the clock runs out. The director had arrived in my absence. His name was Gerald Frost, and he had run Ridgefield for 11 years with a combination of genuine institutional competence and procedural rigidity that tends to develop in people who have spent a decade managing liability in a publicly scrutinized environment. He was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that, because what follows could read as a portrait of someone who was, and it would not be accurate. He was a man who had learned, through 11 years of difficult incidents and county oversight reviews and one lawsuit that had cost the shelter its outdoor volunteer program for 8 months, that the correct response to a containment breach was documentation, protocol, and a defensible outcome. He had arrived with his reading glasses on and a legal pad in his hand, and the expression of a man who was already composing the incident report in his head. He looked up when I came in, then he looked at the file in my hand. I did not give him the summary. I put the 15 pages on the desk in front of him and I said, "Read from the back, please." And something in the way I said it, or something in the weight of the file, or something in the fact that Sandra was sitting 4 feet away with her hand on a dog who was asleep, actually asleep, on the office floor, made him pick it up without argument and begin to read. This was something I had observed about him in meetings over the years. He was not a man who skimmed. When he read with the full allocation of his attention, which in a director with 11 years of institutional responsibility meant that he had learned to read for the thing that was going to create a problem later rather than the thing that was creating a problem now. It was a useful skill in most circumstances. Watching him apply it to Brutus's complete file, I found myself hoping it would be useful in this one. He had started at the back, as I'd asked. He worked forward. I watched his face move through the medical documentation without expression. He had the administrator's capacity to receive information without immediately broadcasting his response to it, and then slow when he reached the behavioral section, and slow further when he reached the 3 paragraphs that the clinic's lead veterinarian had written in the register that was personal rather than clinical. He read those paragraphs twice. I counted. Then he set the file on the desk and took his glasses off and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people look at ceilings when they are organizing something internally and need the visual field cleared. I thought we might be all right. Then his assistant knocked and opened the door and handed him a printed incident report summary, the formal documentation of the morning's breach, compiled by Rays from the security logs, and he put his glasses back on and read it, and when he looked up again, his face had settled into a different configuration. The one I recognized from the 2 county oversight reviews I had attended, measured, contained. Already looking slightly past the current moment toward the one where he would be required to defend whatever decision he made here to someone with a clipboard and a liability framework. He said, a containment breach of this nature triggers mandatory review under Section 14 of our county operating agreement. I said I was aware of that. He said, Section 14 gives me discretionary authority to recommend euthanasia for any animal whose escape has created a documented public safety incident. I said I was also aware of that. He said 41 people were in that courtyard, 4 sustained injuries during the evacuation. We have a minor who was in direct unsupervised contact with the animal for an extended period. Sandra's father, who had been quiet since the director arrived with the patience of a man who had decided to let the institutional process run until the institutional process required his intervention, spoke then for the first time. His voice was the same voice I had heard in the courtyard, measured, without heat, carrying the specific authority of someone who is not angry yet, but is recording everything with the intention of being very precise later. He said the 4 injuries occurred during the crowd evacuation, not from contact with the dog. The incident report you're holding should reflect that if it's been accurately compiled. My daughter was not unsupervised, I was in the building and was located within 11 minutes of the breach notification. And the Section 14 discretionary authority you're describing is a recommendation pathway, not a mandate. The word you used was recommend. There is a difference between what Section 14 allows you to do and what Section 14 requires you to do. Frost looked at him. Sandra's father looked back. On the floor beside Sandra's chair, Brutus had not moved. His head remained on Sandra's foot. His eyes were open and tracking the room with the quiet attentiveness he brought to everything, but his body was still, and the stillness read, to anyone willing to read it, as the opposite of the animal described in the incident report on the director's desk. Frost said, the animal has 2 prior surrender records and a behavioral flag. This morning's breach is a 3rd incident, our insurance framework. His insurance framework, I said, and I had not planned to say it that way, but I did not walk it back, was built around a file that no one here had fully read until 40 minutes ago. Frost looked at me. It was not a friendly look, but it was not the look of a man who had stopped listening. There is a distinction, and it mattered. I told him what I had found in the filing room, not the summary, he had the pages in front of him, but the interpretation of it. The 15 pages submitted by the originating clinic, the specific request to read the behavioral documentation before the incident reports. The evidence that both surrender incidents were fear responses to contextual triggers that the transfer notes had documented and predicted, and that neither subsequent owner had been informed of because the intake process had applied a flag and treated the flag as sufficient. I told him that Brutus had not injured anyone in the courtyard that morning despite 41 people, multiple uniformed personnel, a catch pole, and the specific high-stress conditions that his behavioral history identified as primary triggers. I told him that the animal had run not toward any of the exits or any of the people between him and those exits, but directly toward the one person in the facility who had known him before his flag existed. That is not the behavior of a dangerous animal, I said. That is the behavior of a frightened animal who found safety. And we are the reason he was frightened in the first place, because we kept him in a system for 8 months that read the front of his file and called it understanding. The room was quiet. Sandra, who had been quiet throughout in the way children are quiet when they are listening to adults, decide something important and have calculated that speaking will not help their position, looked at the director with the dark, composed eyes that I had first seen in the courtyard and that I was beginning to understand was simply her default expression, the face of a child who processed the world through patient attention rather than reaction. She said, "He didn't hurt anyone." Frost looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, briefly, at the level of the eyes rather than the mouth, the kind of shift that a man with 11 years of institutional responsibility has learned to keep small and has not entirely succeeded in keeping invisible. He said, "I know that." She said, "He just wanted to find us." The director picked up the file again. He looked at it for a moment, not reading now, just looking, the way you look at something when the decision about what to do with it is no longer really about the thing itself. He set it back down. He took his glasses off again and set them on the desk beside the legal pad on which he had not written a single word since sitting down. What followed was not a dramatic reversal. Gerald Frost did not transform in that office into a different kind of administrator than he had been when he arrived. He was still a man shaped by 11 years of liability and county oversight and the lawsuit that had cost the shelter its outdoor volunteer program for 8 months. He was still going to write an incident report and submit it to the county and document every decision made in this office for the protection of the institution he ran. Those things were true, and they remained true. But he was also, underneath all of that, a man who had gotten into animal welfare for a reason that predated the liability frameworks and the operating agreements and the Section 14 discretionary authorities. People do not spend 11 years in this field because the pay is good. They stay because something in them, before the institution built its walls around it, had cared genuinely about the animals in its custody. I had to believe that was still in there. I was betting on it. He said, finally, addressing Sandra's father rather than me, "If I don't recommend euthanasia, I need an alternative disposition that satisfies Section 14's public safety requirement. That means the animal cannot remain in general shelter population. It means a documented placement plan with a qualified home environment. It means a behavioral assessment conducted by an independent evaluator within 30 days. Sandra's father said, "I understand." A qualified home environment, Frost continued, would need to demonstrate relevant animal handling experience and appropriate physical containment. Sandra's father said, "We run a veterinary clinic." The director looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Sandra. Then he looked at Brutus, who had raised his head from Sandra's foot at some point in the conversation and was watching Gerald Frost with the calm, measuring attention that I had come to understand was not suspicion, but assessment. The dog taking the careful measure of whether this particular human was going to be a safe variable in the environment. Frost held the gaze for a moment. The dog did not look away. "Get me the behavioral assessment waiver form," Frost said to his assistant, "and the alternative disposition paperwork." He picked up his pen. He began to write, not the incident report summary, the disposition recommendation. I did not say anything. Sandra's father did not say anything. Sandra looked at Brutus and Brutus looked back at her, and his tail, which had been still through the entirety of the meeting, moved once, a single, slow arc, low and unhurried, in the way of an animal that has understood something without being told. 11 years of competent administration had built Gerald Frost into someone for whom process was the primary language of care, the belief, not unreasonable in its context, that a well-run system protects more animals than individual empathy ever could. That belief is not wrong. Systems matter. Protocols exist because their absence costs lives. But a system administered without the capacity to recognize when its own framework is producing an unjust outcome is not a well-run system. It is a well-maintained one, which is a different thing. The empathy that Frost had accumulated enough of to stop, to read to the back, to look at a dog on an office floor and update his assessment, that is not a soft quality in an institutional leader. It is the most structurally important quality such a leader can possess. Because systems are built by people and administered by people, and the point at which they fail is always the point at which a person inside them stopped asking whether the system was serving its purpose or had become its own purpose. Gerald Frost asked the question that morning. It cost him something, a defensible position, a clean protocol execution, the comfort of a decision that required no judgment. What it gave Brutus was his life. The exchange was not complicated. It just required someone willing to make it. I need you to do something right now before we continue. Brutus spent 14 months in a system that had reduced him to a flag. He came to that shelter with 15 pages of documentation written by people who had stayed through the night for him, and those 15 pages sat unread at the back of a file, while the flag at the front shaped every interaction he had for 8 months. He was 4 days from a decision that would have been irreversible. If you believe that animals and people who have already survived enough should not be punished by the systems designed to protect them, share this video right now. Not for our numbers. Share it because somewhere tonight there is a dog in a shelter being read from the front of his file, and the people who might read further aren't going to find their way to his kennel unless someone puts this story in front of them. Share it. And if you're not yet subscribed, the community being built here is built out of people who pause before the flag, who read to the back, who believe the 14 weeks are more true than the 2 incidents. Subscribe and be part of that. Brutus is still in that office. There are still 2 more chapters of this story. Let's finish it together. The alternative disposition paperwork had 6 sections and required signatures from 3 parties, and Sandra's father read every line of it before he signed anything. I watched him do this with the specific appreciation of someone who has spent years processing documents that people sign without reading and has observed the consequences of that particular efficiency. He read with a pen in his hand and his glasses, which he had produced from his shirt pocket when the papers arrived, positioned low on his nose, and he asked 2 questions. One about the liability language in Section 3, which he wanted amended to reflect the clinic's existing professional insurance coverage rather than requiring a separate policy rider, and one about the behavioral assessment timeline, which the form specified as 30 days and which he wanted extended to 60 on the grounds that a 30-day assessment of an animal in the immediate aftermath of a high-stress incident was not going to produce a reliable picture of the animal's baseline temperament. Both were reasonable requests. Frost agreed to both, made the amendments by hand, initialed them, and had his assistant witness the changes. It took 22 minutes. In that 22 minutes, the future of Brutus's life was being determined by the careful, line-by-line attention of a man who had learned, through the particular education that comes from caring for living things professionally, that the details of an agreement are where the living things either get protected or get failed. Sandra sat through all of it. At some point she had moved from the chair to the floor beside Brutus, her back against the wall, her legs crossed, one hand in his coat. She was not restless. She was not checking a phone or asking when they could leave. She was present in the complete, unperformed way of a child who understands that something important is happening and has decided her role is to be here for it. Brutus was asleep again. His breathing was the slow, deep rhythm of an animal that has stopped maintaining vigilance, which in the context of everything I knew about his history was the most significant thing that had happened in that office. When Sandra's father signed the final page and Frost countersigned it, I felt the shift in the room the way you feel a weather change, not through a single identifiable signal, but through the accumulation of small things. The way Frost capped his pen and set it down, the way Sandra's father removed his glasses and folded them, the way the assistant took the papers and left and closed the door behind her with the quiet of someone who understood the room had just resolved something. What had been agreed to, in the language of the alternative disposition form, was this. Brutus would be transferred from Ridgefield's custody to the veterinary clinic operated by Sandra's family. Under a temporary foster arrangement pending the independent behavioral assessment, the clinic would assume full liability for the animal during the placement period. Sandra's father would provide Ridgefield with bi-weekly written updates on the animal's behavior and adjustment. At the 60-day mark, the independent evaluator, to be agreed upon by both parties from a county-approved list, would conduct the formal assessment and submit a recommendation to Frost, who retained final disposition authority. In the administrative language of shelter management, this was a structured conditional release. In plain terms, it was a second chance inside a framework careful enough that the people responsible for public safety could stand behind it. But the agreement on paper was the smallest part of what Sandra's family had actually done in that room. The paperwork was the visible architecture of something that had begun long before this morning, before the breach before the courtyard, before the signed forms. It had begun 14 months ago when Sandra's father had looked at a dog tied to a fence post and made a decision, and it had continued through every subsequent decision that the documentation in the file recorded. The surgical intervention, the overnight stays, the careful behavioral notes, the 15 pages submitted to a receiving facility with the specific request that they be read before the flag. Each of those decisions had been an act of advocacy for an animal that could not advocate for itself, and each of them had accumulated into the credibility that made this morning's outcome possible. You cannot walk into a shelter director's office with nothing and negotiate an alternative disposition for a dog who has just caused a containment breach. You can walk in with 15 pages of careful documentation, a professional license, a 4-year record of voluntary behavioral reporting, and the demonstrated history of an animal who had been rehabilitated once by your hands and who, given the opportunity, had run across a crowded courtyard to find your daughter rather than harm anyone in his path. That is what Sandra's father had. He had built it, piece by piece, over 14 months, without knowing he would need it. That is what advocacy looks like before the moment of crisis, not preparation for a specific argument, but the ongoing construction of a record so complete and so credible that when the argument becomes necessary, the record makes it for you. There was one more conversation before we left the office. Frost initiated it, which surprised me. He waited until Sandra's father had the paperwork in order and Sandra was on her feet and Brutus was standing beside her, and then he said, not to the room, specifically to Sandra's father, the latch on Kennel 4 was on a maintenance report submitted in October. I've asked the facilities manager for an explanation of why it wasn't actioned. That's an internal matter, and I'm not going to discuss it further in this context, but I want you to know I'm aware of it. Sandra's father looked at him for a moment, then he said, I appreciate that. It was a small exchange. It did not undo 8 months of a flag being read as a complete document or 6 weeks of a broken latch going unfixed or the 4 people who had twisted ankles and scraped elbows in a corridor because a crowd had panicked. It did not constitute an apology, and it was not offered as one. It was offered as acknowledgement, the institutional version of a person saying, I see what happened here, and I am not going to pretend I don't. In my experience, acknowledgement is rarer than apology and worth considerably more, because apology can be performed and acknowledgement cannot. Frost had seen what the file contained. He had updated his assessment. He had bent his own framework in response to the evidence rather than bending the evidence to fit the framework. That is not a small thing in a person who has spent 11 years building the framework. Sandra led Brutus out of the office on the Lade. In the main corridor, a shelter staff member I knew, one of the kennel technicians who had worked with Brutus during his 8 months with us, was coming from the opposite direction and stopped when she saw them. She looked at the dog, then at the girl. Then at the transfer paperwork visible in Sandra's father's hand, and something in her face moved through a sequence I recognized, because it mirrored what I had felt in the filing room. The arrival of a complete picture after a long time of seeing only part of one. She crouched down in the corridor, the way you crouch when an animal is passing and you want to be at its level without interrupting its movement, and she said, not to Sandra, not to Sandra's father, but to the dog, you're going home. Brutus paused. He looked at her with the measuring attention he brought to everything, and then, not in response to a command, not as a trained behavior, simply as the natural expression of an animal whose nervous system had finally recalibrated to something below the threshold of vigilance, his tail moved, not the single slow arc from the director's office. A full, unhurried sweep, the movement of something that has understood that the thing it was waiting for has arrived. He walked out through the main entrance into the afternoon, with Sandra's hand on his back and her father's hand on the Lade, and the February light, flat and pale, falling across all 3 of them. Advocacy is not a single dramatic act. It is the sustained, unglamorous work of building a record that can speak for someone who cannot speak for themselves, and then showing up, when the moment requires it, to make sure the record is heard. Sandra's father did not save Brutus in the director's office that afternoon. He saved him 14 months earlier, on a morning when nobody would have known or measured the difference if he had made a different choice. The office was where the saving became official. The fence post was where it happened. This is the nature of advocacy. It operates in advance of the crisis. It makes possible to survive. The people who change outcomes for the vulnerable are rarely the ones who arrive at the moment of crisis with a compelling argument. They are the ones who spent the preceding months building the case, line by line, decision by decision, late night by late night, not because they knew a crisis was coming, but because they had decided that the life in their care was worth the full and ongoing expenditure of their attention. That decision, made early and quietly, is the most powerful tool available to anyone who has ever stood between a living thing and a system that had reduced it to a flag. 3 years after the morning, I came around the corner of the kennel block and stopped so fast I nearly fell forward. I went back to the clinic. Not for professional reasons. The case had been closed in the administrative sense long before, the disposition paperwork filed, the assessment submitted, the flag removed from the digital record on a quiet Thursday that had felt larger than any Thursday had a right to feel. I had followed the bi-weekly reports for the duration of the formal placement period, and then, when those ended because the formal period ended, I had stayed in occasional contact with Sandra's father in the way that people stay in contact when a shared experience has left something in both of them that periodic conversation helps maintain. We spoke 4 or 5 times a year. He updated me when something was worth noting. I asked questions when I had them. It was not a friendship exactly. The professional distance was still there, the slight formality of 2 people who had been on the same side of something difficult and respected each other for it without having converted that respect into something more casual. But it was more than professional courtesy. It was the ongoing conversation of 2 people who had both been changed by the same sequence of events and who found, in each other's company, a place to acknowledge that. He had invited me to visit. He had mentioned it more than once across the 3 years, in the offhand way of people who mean an invitation and don't want to press it. I had deferred, and deferred again, with reasons that were genuine at the time and that I eventually recognized as a form of protective reluctance. The sense that the thing I carried from that morning was intact in the shape it had settled into, and that introducing new information might alter it in ways I couldn't predict. What finally moved me was something he said in a call the previous November. We had been talking about the assessment report. I had referenced it in the context of a professional development seminar I was preparing on the limitations of shelter intake behavioral evaluations, and he had said, in the pause after I finished my thought, "You should come and see what he is now. Not for the seminar, just because it's worth seeing." There was something in the way he said worth seeing that was different from an invitation. It was a statement of fact made by a person who had been in daily proximity to something remarkable for long enough that the remarkableness had become ordinary to him, and who still, despite that ordinariness, thought it was worth the hour's drive. I went on a Wednesday in early spring. The clinic occupied a converted property on the county's eastern edge, a building that had been extended twice to accommodate growth, with a modest reception area, 3 examination rooms, a surgical suite that Sandra's father had described in one of our calls as adequate, which is the honest word, and a yard at the back where the boarding animals got their daily exercise. The exterior was unremarkable in the specific way of working buildings whose appearance is the last thing anyone in them has time to consider. I had driven past it 14 months before Brutus arrived there, without knowing it existed, on the way to a county facilities meeting I can no longer remember the purpose of. Sandra's father met me in the reception area. He looked, as he always had since the day I first saw him crossing the shelter courtyard at the pace of a contained sprint, like a man whose relationship with urgency was professional rather than anxious, someone who moved fast because the work required it and stopped completely when the work allowed it, without much evident friction between the 2 states. He shook my hand and offered coffee and showed me around the examination rooms with the brief, practical tour of someone introducing a visitor to a working space rather than a showroom. And then he took me to the yard. It was a mild morning, the spring light arriving at the low, clear angle that makes the world look like it has been recently cleaned. The yard was bounded by a solid timber fence, well maintained, with a gate that I noticed had a latch that was current and solid and showed no sign of deferred maintenance. I noticed this with the professional attention that certain mornings leave permanently installed in a person, and I noticed that I noticed it, and I did not think that was strange. Sandra was in the yard. She was 8 years old now. 3 years is a significant portion of 8, and the child I saw bore the relationship to the 5-year-old in the blue scrubs that a sentence bears to the word it begins with. The same origin, the same essential character, but more of it, more fully realized, extended into space and time in ways the original could only suggest. She was taller. She was wearing, I was not surprised to find, blue scrubs, the same shade, a larger size, the cuffs no longer needing to be rolled up. She was doing homework. She had a book open on a plastic table in the yard's corner and a pencil in her hand, and the expression of focused, slightly impatient concentration that children wear when the work is not difficult enough to be interesting and not easy enough to be dismissed. She was working through it with the methodical efficiency of someone who wants to be done and knows the fastest path to done is straight through the middle. Brutus was lying 3 feet from her chair. He was larger than he had been at Ridgefield, filled out, the lean of the shelter animal replaced by the solid, settled build of a dog in full health, in an environment that had been adequate in every dimension for long enough that his body had been able to become what it was always structured to be. His coat was clean and dense. The chain collar was gone, replaced years ago, Sandra's father had told me, with a simple flat collar in dark blue. He was lying on his side in the morning sun with the complete, boneless relaxation of an animal that has not had to maintain vigilance since it can remember needing to. He heard us come through the gate. His ear moved, just the one, the small rotation of an ear cataloging a sound and filing it as known and unthreatening without the rest of the body considering the sound worth responding to. He did not lift his head. He looked at us from his position on the ground with the dark, unhurried eyes that I had first encountered in an intake kennel, and then he returned his attention to some middle distance that contained nothing I could identify and everything that apparently satisfied him. Sandra looked up from her book. She saw me and looked at her father for a brief contextual confirmation, and then looked back at me with the composed, appraising attention that had apparently been her baseline since birth and had not moderated with age. "You're the one from the shelter," she said. It was not quite a question. I said yes. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "He doesn't remember that day, probably. Dogs don't keep memories the same way." I said I had read that. She said, "But he remembers us. That's different from remembering a day." She said it with the particular authority of a child who has spent 3 years in daily proximity to a veterinarian and has absorbed, through that proximity, the distinction between information and understanding. Remembering us is in his body, not his head. I stood in the yard and looked at Brutus lying in the morning light 3 feet from a child's chair, and I thought about every document I had processed, every flag I had applied, every intake summary I had written in the flat, efficient language of a system designed to manage volume and protect people from harm. I thought about the 15 pages I had found on the floor of a filing room. I thought about the specific weight of the gap between what a file can hold and what a life contains. Sandra had gone back to her homework. The pencil moved across the page with the decisive scratching of a child finishing a problem. Brutus's ear moved once more toward her at the sound of the pencil and then was still. In 4 seconds on a courtyard, this dog had covered the distance between a broken latch and the one person in his accessible world who knew him before the damage. In the 3 years since, in the daily accumulation of mornings in this yard and evenings in that clinic and every ordinary moment between them, he had covered a different kind of distance. The interior kind, the kind that cannot be measured in feet or documented in behavioral reports, the kind that a living thing travels when it moves from the territory of survival into the territory of belonging. He had not traveled it alone. Sandra capped her pencil and closed the book, and looked at Brutus in the way she had apparently looked at him since she was 4 years old, not performing the looking, not narrating it, simply attending to him with the full and uncomplicated presence of someone for whom this particular dog, in this particular yard, on this particular morning, was simply the right and ordinary state of the world. He opened his eyes fully then and looked back at her, and his tail moved once across the ground in the slow, certain arc that I recognized from a director's office 3 years and a lifetime ago. Not performance, not training, not the response of an animal that had learned what the movement produced and was producing it strategically. Just the body's honest record of where it was and who it was with and what that meant. That is the thing a life saved leaves behind. Not gratitude which fades, not memory which distorts, something more structural than either, the permanent alteration of what an animal believes the world to be, written into the body's most basic responses, present in the ear that turns and the tail that moves and the eyes that open fully when the right person closes a book and looks over. A life saved does not end at the saving. It extends, daily and without drama, into every ordinary moment that the saving made possible. I drove back to Ridgefield with the window down and the spring air moving through the car and the image of a dog lying in morning light beside a child doing homework settled somewhere in me that the professional vocabulary I had been trained in did not have a precise address for. It stayed there, it stays there still. The bond that forms between a living thing and the person who chooses to save it does not operate within the boundaries of the event that created it. It extends forward in time, into every morning and every yard and every ordinary Tuesday that the saving made available. Brutus was saved by a decision made at a fence post at 6:40 in the morning, and he lived that decision out daily for the rest of his life, not in dramatic demonstrations of loyalty, but in the small, consistent, bodily evidence of an animal that had learned, against the substantial weight of its own history, that the world contained people beside whom it was safe to stop watching. Sandra gave him this, not by standing still in a courtyard, though that mattered, not by signing a paper, though that mattered too. She gave it by being, from his first night in a recovery kennel to his last morning in the yard, the same person, present, unhurried, asking nothing he was not ready to give. A life saved is not a transaction that concludes. It is a relationship that begins. And the beginning, when it is built on the foundation of genuine and patient care, does not have an end that either party reaches before the other. It simply continues, morning by morning, in the direction of the one who stayed.